Transatlantic relations are under renewed strain as questions grow over US commitment to Ukraine, sharing the burden of Ukraine's defense with Europe, and the impact of President Trump's latest telephone call with Vladimir Putin. With the delay of military aid from the US and diplomacy in a state of flux, we're joined by Ivana Stradner from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a regular contributor. Ivana, welcome back. Good to have you on TVP World again.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation.
It's a pleasure. Ivana, so 90-minute phone call between the two leaders. President Putin proposing a ceasefire over the May 9th commemoration. What do you make of that conversation?
President Trump and Putin had indeed 90-minute conversation, and there were a couple of topics on the table. Number one, it was the question of Iran, of course, the continuation of negotiation, and as you mentioned, ceasefire. So let me start with ceasefire. It is absolutely ridiculous to expect Russia to commit to a ceasefire, because if there is history's any indication, we know how Russia committed and followed through on its promise last year on May the 9th, when it was a ceasefire agreement. Not only that, in April during Easter, there was also supposed to be a ceasefire, and Russia again violated it. And I can go on and on and on. So why has Putin again proposed a ceasefire? Basically, for two reasons. Number one, to show President Trump that he is the one who is willing to be a partner and a reliable actor in negotiations. And as I mentioned, I don't trust that Putin will follow through on this. Any ceasefire for Putin just means buying more time, because Putin does not want to end this war anytime soon. He wants to make a pause, to reposition his military and to continue. Question number two, as you mentioned, was on Iran. And Russia again tried to portray itself as a pillar of stability and a mediator. Why? Because Putin wants to show that he's par on par with the United States and that he's the one who can help with the war. But here is the thing. Russia and Iran have been strategic partners. They have a mutual enemy, the United States. And look, if someone believes in Washington that Putin can be a reliable partner when it comes to negotiations with Iran, it's like literally asking an arsonist to help you with fire. That is ridiculous. As a matter of fact, Russia has been helping Iran when it comes to security matters, when it comes to intelligence matters, with America's actions in the Middle East. So it's not in Putin's interest to actually help the United States in any way. It is rather just to buy more time and to play that manipulation game with Washington.
Ivana, let's take each of those points separately. Let's start with the ceasefire proposal. Now, you know, there are many observers and analysts, such as yourself, who say exactly what you've just laid out for our audience. That is, you can't trust Putin, you know, to keep his word on any kind of ceasefire, and he has no intention of any prolonged ceasefire. Why is it that President Trump doesn't seem to be listening or hearing the same message?
So there are a couple of things. I think President Trump is starting to realize that Putin is indeed not a reliable partner. And I understand in media you're going to hear a lot of things, but President Trump also, you know, forget about sometimes his words, which should focus on his actions. So let's not forget that last time he actually, yes, rolled out the red carpet, but there was above Putin's head American bomber flying, which means, yeah, we are going to treat you nicely, but Russia should know who is the boss. And I think that as the months are unfolding ahead of us, President Trump wants to end this war, and I think he's growing more and more frustrated with the Kremlin. And I think, that there is still an opportunity for the United States to send offensive weapons to Ukraine and more sanctions. So, look, bad news make news in media, but we should also really also start seeing some opportunities here, because I think there are growing voices in Washington, D.C. who understand how Russia, China, and Iran are working together. And this axis has to be dismantled. Iran on one side and Russia on the other side, because the United States has number one enemy, which is China, that has been relying on Iran and Russia as well. So that's one thing. And also, I think it's also very important to talk about negotiations, because that's where I believe that some voices in Washington, D.C., including Mr. Witkoff, believe that peace through trade is possible, and that Putin is interested in business, because America loves to talk about economy and business, which is understandable, but that's part of Russia's negotiation strategy. It's an old KGB game, and that's something that the United States should not fall for. And my third point is, you're sitting in Poland. We already saw drone incursions across Eastern and Central Europe. We saw cutting sea cables. Look, we already see people don't want to talk about this. Putin's latest threats in the Baltics. I'm afraid that Putin is willing to show and test NATO, and to show that NATO is a paper tiger. And that is going to be a huge test for President Trump to follow through on his promise to commit to Article 5. And that's something that we should be paying attention to in the coming weeks and months.
Absolutely. We should be paying attention to that. I'd like to move on now to how you perceive the relationship between President Trump's administration and Europe. And, for example, of course, President Trump has threatened to leave NATO. Germany, he's threatened to put his troops out of Germany, which has about 36,000 American troops stationed there. They seem to be patchy. He seems to like Poland, but not Germany so much at the moment. What's going on?
As I mentioned, media is sometimes acting like a cat chasing a laser, focusing on every statement coming from Washington, D.C. And look, even if we go back to Trump's first term, he was threatening to leave NATO. Did he leave NATO? No. There are a lot of words coming from Washington, D.C., and I don't believe that President Trump will leave NATO. What President Trump wants from Europe is Europe to take more responsibility. But look, Europe has already taken a lot of responsibility. They're investing more in military, in defense. NATO is becoming stronger. So I think that's also something that Washington needs to recognize, because it's Europe now that is sending weapons to Ukraine. I also think that President Trump is a little bit frustrated with Europe's support / lack of support for Washington's actions in the Middle East. And Washington is also not happy to see that some countries in Europe are having very close ties to China. So that's also something that President Trump is not content about. But as I mentioned, those transatlantic differences have been here, for a very long time.
Right.
I like to read,
Very quickly, if I may, Ivana, we're running out of time, and there's one last question that I want to put to you. The US the Pentagon has finally released $400 million for Ukraine, but that's been sitting there for a while. There was bipartisan approval for that amount to be sent to Ukraine, but it wasn't immediately. Why the delay?
I don't know really why the delay, or also, things that I see with sanctions on oil and gas and Russia. These things are absolutely ridiculous and unacceptable, because Putin's center of power and pillar of stability stems from Russian energy and economy. And we have to make sure to stop the war machinery. And the only way that we can stop it is to actually undermine Russian economy and to stop Putin's funding the war. So the sooner the United States imposes even more severe sanctions on Russian energy sector, as well as secondary sanctions, and provide Ukraine with serious offensive capabilities, the sooner the war will end, because that's the only language that Putin understands.
Understood. Ivana, as always, thank you so much for laying out your analysis for our audience, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of this bulletin of World News Tonight. But as always, there's lots more coming up, so don't go away. Bye-bye.